Hey, TwiliteMinotaur, Blue Adept here. I thought I'd reply to your vids. I find them very interesting. First of all, the question of whether or not consciousness is computational is interesting. Whether or not we can reduce consciousness to computation. Now, in most of our discussions and everybody else's discussions, we tend to assume that consciousness is reducible to computation for the simple reason that if we said it wasn't, we wouldn't really know where to go from there, right? If it's not computational, then what the hell is it? We can't even fathom that possibility. At least I can't. So it's easier for us to assume that consciousness is computational and see whether or not we can show that that results in some contradictions or obvious, an obvious breakdown in the argument. Can we rule out? Can we start off with the assumption that consciousness is computational and then somehow show that assumption must be wrong? Rule it out. Well, one other interesting point that you brought up is whether or not consciousness is a gradient. In other words, can we say that everything has some degree of consciousness, and as things get more complex, in the right way, of course, then they acquire more and more of this property called consciousness, sentience, whatever. Or is it not a complete gradient? Is it not the case that everything has some degree of consciousness, but rather that there is some threshold along the way below which things don't have any degree of sentience? In no sense can they be considered an experiencer of anything. Whereas above that threshold, then you have a gradient, where as things get more complex in the proper way, then they become more and more sentient. So, gradient versus threshold, or gradient versus combination of threshold and gradient, is an interesting question. And I think that question, we can address it along a few different axes. We can look at the axis of evolutionary development, which we've already been doing when we discussed parameciums versus frogs versus whatever, humans. And but another interesting axis that you can look at is development. So if you pick a particular animal, let's say humans, and you look at the development of a human from the time that a sperm and an egg come together, at what point along that developmental line can you say, okay, has something occurred at this point where a threshold has been, a threshold was passed, and now we have a being that is an experiencer? And where along the developmental line is that? Is that at the fetus stage, the 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? It's kind of interesting that even though I am the result of such a process, I cannot point to a particular, I personally can't point to a specific place in time where I became an experiencer. But that doesn't rule out that there wasn't a specific point. Simply because it's likely that for some period of time I was an experiencer, but I didn't have the cognitive tools of memory to record the fact, to remember the fact down the road that I was an experiencer. So there may have been a who knows how long of a period of time there was where I was experiencing something, I was an experiencer of some sensation, but I wasn't equipped to record that I was, or to remember that I was. And by the time that I did develop the cognitive ability to record and remember the fact that I was an experiencer, I had already been an experiencer for a fairly long period of time, a number of years already. Maybe I was 7 by then, maybe 6, who knows. Another interesting, you briefly brought up the idea of emergent properties and discussing consciousness as an emergent property, and you very briefly brought up the idea of wetness. Can we attribute wetness to one water molecule, 2 water molecules? I think that's an interesting analogy, and I'm a fan of thinking of consciousness in terms of, it being an emergent property. But at the same time, I think you have to be careful to differentiate types of emergent properties, because something like wetness is a fundamentally different kind of emergent property than consciousness, in the sense that wetness is still a function of outside observers, right? Wetness only exists in the eye of the beholder, whereas whether or not a thing is an experiencer, whether or not something has consciousness as an emergent property, that is independent of outside observers, right? If I'm a conscious being or an experiencer of a sensation, I am an experiencer of that sensation independently of whether or not anybody thinks I am. So I think that's a little different than wetness. And finally, the other thing I wanted to bring up that your video got me thinking a bit about the interesting relationship between consciousness and incantation and ritual and magic. Because if we do assume that consciousness is computational or reducible to computation, then we have an interesting analogy between the magic of consciousness, if you will, and the way that in mythology incantation, ritual, and magic work. Because when we think about incantations and rituals, what we're talking about is going through a set of steps, ritualized steps, which, due to some emergent property of magic, causes demons to come into being, or certain results, certain things to be affected in the real world. And I think that's not dissimilar from the idea of saying that if consciousness is computation, what that means is that as you take physical matter and arrange that physical matter to interact in a specific way, in a specific computational sequence, a very long and complex computational sequence, but a computational sequence nonetheless, just by virtue of the fact that matter is undergoing a specific set of physical interactions, that somehow, by virtue of the fact that matter has just interacted in a specific way, from that somehow arises a conscious experiencer. That is quite similar to the idea of incantation or ritual or magic. So sometimes when I talk about consciousness, I will refer to it as a magical thing, a magical process. What is the magic? And it's because I see that analogy. Anyway, thanks for your videos. I found them all very interesting. I think you're one of the few people that actually understands a lot of what I'm saying many times. So, yeah, I look forward to hearing more from you.